Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us going. Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here, get us going. And there we go. Sorry, stuck there.
Well, everybody gets
okay. All right, good morning, everyone. It's technical difficulties always. So welcome to part 4 in our equity series. And today's topic is system action, getting started and moving equity forward. I am not going to read this slide to you. We will be introducing, we have a wonderful moderator who will be introducing the panelists in a moment. I do want to say who we are, Workforce Community Solutions. This is a project that is funded from the California Workforce Development Board, a Workforce Accelerator grant. It consists of 3 county regions, San Francisco, Alameda, and Contra Costa counties. And we're focused on breaking down workforce system silos to increase economic equity. And we're doing this via a series of online events to share effective models and strategies and increase collaboration and communication across the region. This is a slide that will show you the logos for our core planning team. And this is a list of our broader community team partners in this project. I do want to take a minute to acknowledge our position on equity. This is what we are about. So we acknowledge that community members in our Bay Area region are disproportionately harmed by policies, systems, and beliefs that disadvantage based on race, gender, and ability. Poverty, incarceration, trauma, homelessness, etc., are symptoms of biased policies and practices. Due to the inequitable access to opportunities and resources, responses must be multi-generational, systemic, and rooted in policies and practice that acknowledge the inequities and promote inclusion and full participation. We also always want to acknowledge and give voice to these givens. Racism is real. White supremacy permeates the globe. Oppression is working 24/7. It is structural and systemic, and we are fighting historic and generational inequities. So now I would like to keep us moving and introduce our wonderful moderator today. I'm so honored to introduce Diane Johnson. She is the founder of MAPO, and I apologize if I'm saying that wrong. I should have asked you how to say that. Sure. Management Consulting, a national firm committed to aligning mission, vision, and values for purpose-driven businesses, philanthropic institutions, the social sector, tech companies, and market leaders. Diane's expertise in strategic development, cultural capacity, DEI, organizational development, institutional capacity building, leadership development and collaboration, community engagement has been used by more than 11,250 organizations and leaders. Previous clients include the U.S. Forest Service, Habitat for Humanity International, the Kresge Foundation, HUD, Career Gear, Sustainable Business Network of Philadelphia, and Neighborhood Works America. She is a published author of several books, including the Cultural Diversity Field Book. Diane received her PhD from Tufts University in Interdisciplinary Studies, a Master in Divinity from Pacific School of Religion, the Graduate Theological Union, her MA in Nonprofit Management from the New School, and a BA in Communications from the University of Pennsylvania. She currently serves as Vice Chair of the Conscious Capitalism Bay Area. Please welcome Diane, and take it away, Diane.
Great, Donna. Thank you so much. And I'm really delighted and incredibly excited to participate in our panel this morning. You know, these are really intense, crazy times, right? I think that that's a what I call a BFO, a blinding flash of the obvious. You know, the unprecedented, unprecedented, you know, we're in a global pandemic where our economy is just spiraling downward. And so the challenges that we face, that folks face in the industry of workforce development is really is unheard of. You know, the Supreme Court Justice from the 40s, Oliver Wendell Holmes, once said, "A mind that is stretched by a new experience never goes back to its old dimensions." And one of the things that we're hoping for this morning, that the conversations and the dialogue and the presentations, is that your minds will not go back to their original shape. I'm sure there's some things that are going to be shared that are going to be obvious to those of us attending this call, and then there also will be innovative and new insights that the panel is going to share. So I'm really delighted to introduce our panelists. We have Lysandra Dial, who is Interim Workforce Board Director for the City of Oakland, yay Oakland, given that I'm a 15-year resident of Oakland. Josh Arche, who's Workforce Board Director for San Francisco. Greg Irish, who's Workforce Board Director for the City of Los Angeles. And Donna Van Wert, who is the board director for Contra Costa County. And then we also have Bob Lanter, who is director for the California Workforce Board Association. So we're delighted to have all of you join us this morning. Each panelist is going to take between 8 and 10 minutes. And then the whole panel will move into a discussion with ourselves and with you submitting questions from the chat. So Alessandra, I will have you start us off.
No, we're a little
Greg,
out of,
Greg,
yeah,
we're out of orders. Greg should be.
yeah, it's going to be me. First of all, thank you. This is Greg Irish from the City of LA. I first want to thank the good doctor for kicking this thing off. Great remarks. I noticed she went to the New School. I've got a soft spot in my heart, especially for that divinity degree that you have. Secondly, in terms of Donna, I want to just tell you, I'm going to add some things to what you said in terms of acknowledging racism exists, sexism exists, ageism exists, and there's some other isms that we need to include in this discussion as well. And with that, also workforce development. We're here because workforce development is more than we thought it was. It's immigration reform, it's prison reform, it's income equality, it's economic development, it's gender equity, and it's racial equity. So we know what our tasks are today. And let me just say that, and I'm timing myself so I can get through this, California has been traditionally viewed as a haven for diversity and inclusion, but in reality, our state has had a shameful history of discrimination against people of color, LGBT folks, and others. Addressing the problems of racism and discrimination has been difficult with us because we believe we're sort of stuck in a condition of multicultural blindness. We think we're ahead of everybody else and we're so enlightened. But we finally come to realize that things are askew in this state. And by watching what's transpiring in the streets today, the Black Lives Matter movement, et cetera, and also COVID-19 is on our minds every day. Let me just say about COVID-19, I didn't put in my slides anything about the flu pandemic of the Spanish flu pandemic of the 1918 and 1919. It killed 675,000 people in this country, 40 million worldwide. And if you look at the stats, and I did, the people who were most impacted by the Spanish flu in the United States out of those 675,000 were people of color. So we've been here before. We've been here before. As a famous baseball player, and we're in baseball championship series now, Yogi Berra said, it's deja vu all over again. And then one of my favorite journalists, novelists, and critics, it was John Paul Alphonse Kerr said, he coined the phrase, the more things change, the more things stay the same. So we need to realize that. And so this is an aha moment. And where do we begin to make changes? I'm going to start with data and assessments that illuminate the disparities, because data can inform us. It can inform our decision-making and our professional judgments, and data can compel us to target our responses in workforce development to implement evidence-based interventions. And I think that's critical. So to jumpstart the process, I'm going to give you the lay of the land in California in terms of the populations of need. From there, you can begin to think about the appropriate distribution of resources and services, this is workforce development, to promote the advancement of racial equity and justice. So let's go to the first slide. First slide tells you the history. I just mentioned it. Prop 209. There's a long history. Even when California was formed, the second governor of California wanted to ban African Americans who were not already living in California from coming to California. You had riots, you had what happened to Rodney King. You can go back to Zoot Suit riots against the Latino community, riots against the gay community. Ronald Reagan, when he was governor, opposed the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which the Fair Housing Act prohibited discrimination against landlords, prevented landlords from discriminating against African Americans from renting property or selling property. And I actually bought a piece of property where currently in LA, some of the covenants still haven't been removed from the deeds, which said you can't sell to Negroes. Let's go to the next one. This is what's transforming us. These are some of the things that have started our movement in terms of us coming to the realization that California isn't the land of plenty and isn't the land of everyone being equal. When we look at Black Lives Matter, COVID-19, some of the things being proposed by the legislature in terms of reparations, you've got other things in terms of eliminating Prop 209, you've had George Floyd, et cetera. We've been through this before, but now this is the beginning of a new movement. Go to the next slide. California's population. Remember, we need to know what's going on here before we start talking about solutions. 39.9 million people. Go to the next slide. Out of that, California is the largest population of any state of people of color. California is the largest population of any state of whites and Hispanics and Latinos. California is the 5th largest population of African Americans, the largest population of any state of Asians. 1/3 of the nation's Asian population lives here. And California has the 3rd largest population of any of Native Americans behind Arizona and Oklahoma. Keep going. Population by race, you can see it. The Latinx population, 15 million. African Americans, 2.5. Asians, 6 million. White, non-Hispanic or non-Latinx, 14.6. Native Americans, 638,000. Native Hawaiians, 199,000. Keep going. These are the cities we live everywhere where African Americans live. Alameda, go back to that slide. You went too far ahead. Yeah, next slide. Alameda, Oakland, go back to that one. Oakland, Emeryville, just about every county has folks of color and specifically African Americans. So if folks tell you they don't live here, we don't need a racial equity plan, we live everywhere. Keep going. Poverty. When you look at poverty, African Americans, the poverty rate of African Americans is phenomenal. 21.9%. Native Americans, 20.38%. Latino or Latinx, 19.2%, Native Hawaiians, et cetera. When you compare it to whites, 9.51%. So we know where poverty is. Keep going. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. When we talk about where the nation's immigrants live, they live in California, Texas, and New York. There are 700,000 deferred DACA action recipients in the US. California has more DACA recipients than any other state. And by the way, where it says Emma Lazarus, the Statue of Liberty was first conceived as a gift to the United States in acknowledgement of the end of slavery, not immigration. But it's wonderful. We'll let them in terms of immigration being part of it. Keep going. In 2017, 29 million immigrants were working or looking for work in the US. Documented immigrants made up the majority of immigrant workers at 21.2 million. An additional 7.6 million immigrant workers were unauthorized, less than the total of the previous year, and notably less than 2017, where there were 8.6. So this big immigrant thing, is made up. Immigrants are critical to our economy. We need to talk about that in terms of equity as well. Keep moving. Unemployment. We all know African Americans and people of color have the highest rates of unemployment. That's changing every month. We've been the folks who've been hit the hardest by COVID in terms of the Latinx community, the African American community. We know what's happening with unemployment. COVID has made things worse. Keep going. Racial and ethnic minorities, well, let's acknowledge, most of the military is made up of racial and ethnic minorities. So we talk about who's patriotic and who's not. We bear the full burden of patriotism for this country. Keep on moving on. California population by gender. Never talk about equity and equality until you talk about gender as well. I am from a family of 5 sisters, so it's been ingrained in me. My 2 sisters were police captains. The thing is, my father was a deputy police chief. The 2 girls followed in my dad's footsteps. But when you're in a family like mine, you realize women should be paid equally to men, and we are confining our workforce development system and our labor markets, confining women to low-wage jobs when they have the highest levels of education. Let's go to the next slide. Employment status by gender, as you can tell that the unemployment rate for women is higher than men, and as again, women have the highest rates of education and skill levels than men, but disproportionately are represented within the ranks of the unemployed. Keep going. Earnings and educational attainment. It's interesting, a lot of women do well with education, and again, but they're underpaid, and we need to acknowledge that. Keep going. And again, it's hard. When you get to talk about equity, some people say, are you a woman, or are you black? Are you a woman, or are you Latinx? It's like saying, do you need your left arm or your right arm? We need to talk about these issues both from a racial and an ethnic perspective, but also from a gender perspective. Keep going. Next slide. That's it for me in terms of what I think. The next slide is poverty by education. We know the less education you have, the more chances you are impoverished, the more chances are that you can't connect to the workforce. Keep going again. Any other ones? Did I have anyone, Josh? And poverty by education. I think that's enough. In order for us to make decisions, we're going to have to look at the demographics of our communities at a sub-level, the demographics of California. We're going to have studies. We're going to have to look at new interventions in terms of workforce development. Most of the folks that we talk to who are African American and Latinx, in our system, we tell them, we're going to send you to training. And most of them are saying, I am working at minimum wage. I can't afford to go to training. So we've got to talk about new approaches in terms of supportive services, et cetera. And then we've got to talk about making sure that they are trained for jobs that pay living wages. And then we have to put pressure on those industries within California that are currently not hiring folks of color and women. And by the way, we've made some progress. The Supreme Court recently decided that the LGBTQ community is now protected in the environment in terms of employment. We've got to adjust to that as well. We don't capture enough data in our system to make sound decisions as to workforce development. We don't have a box that checks anything about gender in terms of, we do in terms of men and women. And on our driver's licenses now, you can have other designations, but we don't do it with workforce development. And we'll start discussing with the good doctor, leading some of the discussions of what we need to do to actually tackle some of these issues, including developing gender equity plans. So for the sake of time, I'm anxious to engage in those decisions. And doctor, that's my presentation. When we make some of these decisions, we need data to prove that our decisions are legitimate and that our decisions are worthwhile. And by the way, unless we elevate the fastest growing populations in this state from an economic standpoint, all of us are in trouble in terms of our status within this state. Thank you.
Greg, thank you so much. And I think that was a brilliant start off in terms of creating context and framing our conversation. So I think beautiful first presentation. And now I want to introduce Lysandra Dial, Interim Workforce Board Director for the City of Oakland.
Thank you.
Cassandra?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for, I'm really honored and excited to be here with my colleagues across the state and just to really talk about some of the work that we're doing in the city of Oakland. So next slide. Oh, well, my quote is not in there, so that's okay. I had a quote, so I'll just read it. I have my notes. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. We usually start off a lot of our conversations in the city of Oakland with using this quote from James Baldwin. And so I really want to spend a few minutes. I have a limited amount of time, a lot of information to share with you about some of the changes that have been made in the city of Oakland to advance racial equity. But what I want to do is a little framing around the work that we're doing, introduce you to our racial equity impact analysis and the worksheet that we use. And I tried to put it in the chat and it's not working. So I'll make sure that gets made available to everyone because I'm just challenged with PowerPoints. I'll just out myself. And then finally, I want to go into how we use that tool to apply to our workforce. We owe a adult and youth RFP process a few years ago. And so many of you probably have been participating in this series. It's been awesome and know that the City of Oakland has a Department of Race and Equity. Darlene Flynn, our director, participated in the first workshop on July 23rd. So if you didn't participate, I say go listen to that because she'll really ground some of the work that we're doing. But I did want to offer that the city, by city ordinance, this department was created in 2015 and it officially launched in 2016. So I won't read this mission because I know I have a limited time and I have a lot to get through. So next slide. Next slide. Josh. Oh, that things are out of order. Can you go back one? I think did things get out of order? Oh, yeah, some of my slides didn't get in. So I'll just read them and I'll make sure that the appropriate slides get put in. But what we do, I wanted to ground the work that we do. We have some working assumptions. That meaning that race matters. Almost every indicator of well-being shows troubling disparities by race. And that wouldn't be more true than the 2018 Racial Equity Indicators report that the City of Oakland released. And we looked at 6 themes. We looked at the economy, education, public health, housing, public safety, and neighborhood and civic life. And then those various areas were scored. A score of 1, the lowest score of 1 was the highest level of inequity, and 100 being the highest level of equity. The city scored as a whole 33.5 out of 100. So we failed. But it set our baseline. And so it clearly shows that we have a lot of work to do. And I know some people may be surprised. We are the city that birthed the Black Panther movement. We are a sanctuary city. We are a very activist city. We're about that town business. I mean, that's our saying that we say in Oakland. And yet we still, as a city, as many cities across this country, these systems were built on racism. And so we have a lot of work to do, but I bet you the folks who are living in Oakland and experiencing Oakland, they can tell you that this is very accurate. This is their lived experience. So next slide. So how we approach the work in the city of Oakland, go back one, is through our workforce, sorry, not workforce, but our race and equity teams. Every department, almost every department in the city of Oakland has a race and equity team. There's our public works, our Department of Transportation, our police department, fire department, finance, my department, economic and workforce development. We all have race and equity teams. The role of the race and equity teams are to do capacity building within our departments, to advance the race and equity and develop outcomes, and also to apply a framework and a structure inside of our departments of how we do this work. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the race and equity impact analysis. I'm not going to read all of those bullets, but they'll be available to you. But what I want to say, it is a framework, a template that we use to guide our change process. We recognize that this is not going to be, it's not an immediate fix-all. It's not a cure-all to racial injustice and the systems that have been created. But when you're explicit and you're applying a racial equity framework, that we're moving closer to that vision and away from inequities and the status quo. And so that's the role, and that's how we apply the analysis. Next slide. So I'm going to go through this really quickly. This is where I thought I was going to be able to put the worksheet in so you can actually see. But I want to at least read through the prompts. We'll make it available to you, but what I'm going to walk through next is how we use this actual worksheet to apply to our RFP, and I think that might be of interest. So the first thing is we use this in all of our departments to look at new or revising policies, procedures, and practices. First prompt is really looking at setting an equitable result and outcome, gathering the right information, the data, which Greg just pointed out. What does it look like? What does that look like in the city of Oakland? Identify and engaging our stakeholders, important that they are part of this process. Then identifying what are the actual equity gaps, and then what does it take to fill those gaps? What are the steps it's going to take to make sure those gaps are filled? What does it look like to implement? And then the evaluation and accountability, which is so critical. It's not enough to just say we served 100 people and we place, them in jobs. Like, is anyone better off? So what we apply is a results-based accountability, which has 3 prompts. How much did we do? How well did we do? And is anyone better off? Because that's what matters in the end, is the outcomes. Next slide. So what the first thing we did was we looked at the data and we came up with this desired equitable outcome for the city of Oakland. And that's all Oaklanders have economic security and equitable access to workforce development services. And looking at the disparities, we used some data that was presented, a study that was done by one of our partners, workforce partners in the city of Oakland called BOSS, that works with returning citizens. And what they did a study really looking at the neighborhoods that there had been disinvestment. And that was 5 zip codes in the city of Oakland: 94621, 94603, 94605, 94601, and 94607. And these are communities that have high unemployment and also have large communities of Black and Latinx residents. And so what are our charges, and how do we improve the outcomes for folks in these communities? Next slide. So the next step in the process was to develop, how do we then help and change the outcomes for the individuals living and the residents living in those various communities, the zip codes that I laid out. The first was really looking at how do we put funding? Workforce funding needs to be distributed in those areas. We need to do capacity building workshops with those organizations. What are the access in those communities? How do we partner with some of these organizations in the zip codes so that we can have more access points? Doing things really creative. There's a BOSS in particular does pop-ups. They have pre-pandemic, they were doing pop-up, workforce pop-ups, where they would go to a certain corner in deep East Oakland and just have a pop-up and invite people to talk about their services. I thought that was very unique and different and something that we can replicate when the pandemic is over. Exploring partnerships, engaging the residents in these zip codes around their needs and wants. And just a caveat here that kept coming up is this focus group fatigue. So I caution us as professionals of going into communities, evaluating, asking questions, asking some of the same questions year after year after year, and the community not seeing any outcomes. And so I just caution that, because that kept coming up, and I'll talk about what we did to try to eliminate some of that fatigue that some of our citizens are seeing from folks like us who are coming in asking questions. Whereby addressing the residents' needs. Next slide. presenting this, the analysis and outcomes to our workforce board, it was very important that our board really grounded in this work, that they understand as members of our workforce boards, being business and mandated partners, that they now have the same charge, that we want them to then go into their business and we want them to sing the song of this is what we're doing in the city of Oakland, this is the workforce board's work, and these are the communities that we're serving, and that we center race. And so that gives them license. So it was very important that that got codified. I don't know how long I'll be there or someone else, so we needed to make sure that was really grounded in our work. Streamline the contracting process is something that's totally out of my control, right? But it's hard doing business if you're a small entity in deep East Oakland, West Oakland, or our Fruitvale area to do business with the city of Oakland. So how do we streamline that process? That's not something I can do, but working with the other partners, the other departments, how do we do that? Developing, doing some workshops with our service providers. How do you ground this work? It's new for some folks, right? I'm new to the work, this part of the work, the official work. So we wanted to make sure they understood that as part of our service providers, then developing equity tools, and then meeting with them about how to track. I'm down to like 1 minute, so I'm gonna go to the next slide really quickly and just talk about some things that we completed, and just know we issued an RFQ for our consultant. They were required to demonstrate the work that they've done around race and equity. We want to work with people who value the work that we do in the city. So that was one of the prompts. We had a board retreat where we looked at the conditions of well-being, and really let them like vision, what does it look like? What are the measures that we want, and how can they be involved? We issued the stakeholder engagement. We did some work when we were updating our local plan, and some of you workforce boards know all about that. And I'll keep checking the time. Sorry, everyone, I'm going really fast. We did some stakeholder input to develop our RFP process. And again, with the caveat with the fatigue, we piggybacked on processes that other departments were doing. Because we're working so closely together, we knew that there was other engagement going on. So we piggybacked, we went into the communities with them. We asked the questions there, or made it a part of their process. And then finally, we issued the RFP, and we did all of this in a very short period of time, like 4 or 5 months. We made sure that those communities were identified, the funding resources were structured around who had the greatest unemployment. The bidders had to identify their outreach and marketing engagement. And then we put this language into our equity plan. And I think I made it, Dr. Johnston. Really talking fast. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Lysandra. And during our discussion, we'll also have time to share other details. And I can imagine that everyone on the call is really impressed with the level of specificity of your plan. So, and we are making all of the slides available to everyone on the call. So now I would like to introduce Josh Arce from the Workforce Board of Directors for San Francisco. And Josh, I think I mangled your last name. I apologize in advance.
Not a problem, not a problem. I'm dual, sorry team there. Your quotes there, it looks great. It's just not pulling up, Lysandra. I apologize. And I think I bungled one of your slides too there, Brother Greg. I'm an apprentice slide PowerPoint type of individual. But yes, just really excited to be here with my colleagues and with you all, such as an esteemed group. Thank you to the California Workforce Development Board for funding this series, Pathways Solutions, Bay Area Community Resources, everyone for getting us together for these series of conversations, our own Human Rights Commission. Just a quick overview again, as Dr. Johnson said, my name is Joshua Arce. I'm the Director of Workforce Development here in San Francisco, and under the leadership of Mayor London Breed and our Department Director, Joaquin Torres, we're seeking to advance an equitable and shared prosperity for all San Franciscans in this work, particularly during the COVID crisis. Our office is focused on 3 things: supporting unemployed San Franciscans, 2, addressing persistent employment inequities and preparing to emerge from the pandemic even stronger through programs such as the Mayor's Opportunities for All Youth Employment Initiative. just always like to give a real quick shout out to those men and women, those community-based organizations doing the work on the ground. It's such a challenging time. We know that in our neighborhoods, such as the Mission District, Hunters Point, Chinatown, Fillmore Western Addition, community leaders such as, that's our own Ruth Barajas there, one of the conveners through Bay Area Community Resources, doing great work, and Mission Language Vocational School, young community developers in Hunters Point, self-help for the elderly in Chinatown, and Collective Impact, just really helping us survive. And always like to give a shout out to those folks on the front lines that are really doing the work in the community. Through our office, and we are grateful to Oakland and Director Dial and her team. Oakland was the first to get out there and create their Office of Racial Equity, and it was really exciting, I think, for all of us doing this work, not just around workforce, but to really advance a racial equity lens across all government decision-making. Our version here in San Francisco, we call our Principles of Employment Equity, in partnership with our Human Rights Commission Director, Cheryl Davis, and our Director of Racial Equity, Shakira Simley. In our Office of Racial Equity, we seek to name inequity in our system and guide strategies to address these inequities through our planning and funding. Much in the way that Lysandra has described, and as befits Oakland being the first, we seek to really, and there's Director Davis joining us as we speak. We seek to, hello, Director Davis. We seek to close these employment gaps where they exist and make sure that race, ethnicity, gender, justice involvement, sexual orientation, gender identity, that none of these factors are a predeterminant of success. So we look at community voice, we look at employment data. I think going back to this presentation, the big picture, Director Irish, the information that Director Irish presented, big picture is that key employment data piece. And where I want to add to the narrative here and kind of the San Francisco kind of case study for consideration is around the pairing of community voice and employment data. And that's in an experience that, let's see if I can click through here, is going to illustrate how we looked at the communities that we served and found where there's the darker blue, there's the higher unemployment, where we found in our location of our neighborhood job centers with these larger circles. This story in the next 5 minutes is about how community voice and employment data led us to the creation of our 7th neighborhood job center right here in a neighborhood called Lakeview OMI. Now that neighborhood for many years was led and really represented well as such a powerful community voice by a legendary organizer named Mike Brown, who sadly passed away in 2016. But for many, many years, decades in fact, was calling attention to this neighborhood, the OMI Lakeview, as a forgotten neighborhood. High unemployment, particularly stories of high unemployment around Black youth, Black young adults, the Black community that didn't get the same resources as other neighborhoods, job seekers in this community. And his organization, Inner City Youth, was very much advocating for bringing those resources home. I became Director of Workforce Development under Mayor London Breed in 2018, sadly, a couple years after Mike Brown had passed. But one of the first things that we did was to work with his daughter, Gwen Brown here, to look at some of the data, to say what's happening. We know the community voice for decades has been speaking to disparity, but we ran the data from some of the same data sets that's been presented by directors Irish and Dial, this stuff we get from the Fed's American Community Survey estimates. Couple trends we saw: citywide unemployment, 5.45%, neighborhood, OMI neighborhood unemployment, significantly higher. But what was most inequitable here in this case study is we look at, generally speaking, our story is that, like the state, Black unemployment nearly triple that of the citywide average. But in this particular neighborhood, something even deeper and more inequitable. White unemployment of 3%, Black unemployment 15%, 5 times higher. So what we did was we invited Gwen to come speak to our workforce board. Gwen Brown, Mike's daughter, carrier of the torch, building out this organization with the mission of bringing a job center home to this neighborhood. So in her visit to our workforce board, Gwen told the story of community voice, that decades of advocacy to bring resources to right these wrongs. And she used some of this data. She paired that community voice with the employment data to illustrate the undeniable inequity. She also, of course, reminded us that behind these numbers is people. And that's who we ultimately seek to serve, and that's who represents the change. But the pairing of community voice and employment data that showed this racial inequity, particularly around Black unemployment, led to a year later, helped us make the case to launch that job center out there in OMI Lakeview. The 7th of our neighborhood job centers opened a year to the date from that time, with the mayor, the district supervisor, Asha Safai, who advocated for these resources. And what the next step of this journey has been about for us has been the evaluation, because we're blessed that we have a mayor who cares deeply about racial equity. We have a Human Rights Commission Director, Cheryl Davis, an Office of Racial Equity, and Director Simley, and all of us able to be and have the fortune of having this kind of political will to also match the community voice. But whether you don't have the political will or do, and I think that's part of the conversation when we talk about Donna's experience, we're dealt the hand that we're dealt. The data becomes critical in any scenario. And so for us, we knew the work was happening, amazing work. Here's Gwen and the Inner City Youth team today during COVID. They're holding it down with COVID response, COVID resources, hubs, not just for unemployment, which is now, of course, like everywhere, gone into double digits in our city and even higher in this neighborhood. But here's where the key piece of the puzzle comes together. And I say this especially for community-based organizations who are on. It's the part of playing the game, because the bane of a lot of existence, I know when I was working in nonprofit, and I was always grateful to grants we got from the San Francisco Foundation, for example. I know Rob Hope is here in his amazing work he's doing regionally, is that with Rework the Bay, is that these reports can really kind of feel and in some ways juxtaposed against the work itself, but we know they're critical for workforce directors. So Gwen Brown with her fiscal agent, Young Community Developers, took this blank form, really buckled down, and helped give us the data that we needed to tell the story, to play the game, so to speak. So in showing that this investment was not only going to enroll participants, 75 participants, and these job placement numbers and these outcomes, but this report helped show us that in the race ethnicity data and the zip code, the neighborhood-based data, this helped us tell the story that this investment was in fact working to help make steps toward addressing that inequity. So that information and all that work was crystallized for us, and going back to that same workforce sport to speak in that kind of government speak kind of workforcey type of language, to say our $200,000 grant to inner city youth, fiscally sponsored by YCD, to support the OMI Job Center, supports job readiness, employment placement for 75 job seekers, 150 residents over the past 2 years. But access to that data and community leaders going out there and getting that data, not just doing the work, but playing the game and get us that data, allowed us to say 151 residents served, of which 96 were Black, a total of 64%, and more than half were right there from that neighborhood that we seek to serve. So as a result, we're able to make the case, expand the funding, and so in this year, their grant nearly doubles to $380,000 to go serve even more individuals and allow us to take this data and evaluate, are we closing that gap? Are we righting these wrongs? And that's what we're building our system upon in San Francisco. Proud to be members of California Workforce Association, and I will turn it back to you, Dr. Johnson.
Josh, Dr. Ash, thank you so much for such a inspiring and thoughtful presentation. And I can't wait to ask you questions during our conversation period. And now I'm delighted to introduce Donna Vernet-Wirt, who is our director in the county of Contra Costa. Donna.
Thank you. And again, good morning, everyone. I want to acknowledge that we are all in different stages on this journey and this work that we're doing. And also want to acknowledge that I feel Contra Costa is in very baby step stages. So we have a lot to learn and a lot of work to do before us. But I do want to share two things that I think that we are working on that is making a difference. So next slide, please, Josh. So in 2017, when I first took over as the director for Contra Costa, we were in a huge budget deficit. We were running 4 brick and mortar career centers at the time, and under the county umbrella, which is fairly costly, and it was not sustainable. So we decided to go out for procurement for our service delivery. First time we'd ever done that in Contra Costa County. So to that end, I started meeting with community-based organizations in our county that had already been great partners and that I knew were doing some phenomenal work serving their communities. So I asked them what they thought and what might be possible if we put some of our WIOA dollars into the community, into these CBOs that were already doing great work. How could that help promote the work and do it across all of Contra Costa County? So the result was we put out a procurement, and that led to the development of the Contra Costa Workforce Collaborative. This was under the leadership of Rubicon Programs. So now in Contra Costa, we have a networked system of providers, 11 total, with locations throughout the county from far west to far east, that are now able to provide WIOA services on top of already the services that they have already been providing. So we hope this is really, I believe this is really getting, again, to some of the things that Josh and Lisander talked about, really putting the money in the communities to help them further the work they're doing. So I hope and believe that the money that we're adding helps the capacity for everyone to serve their communities in a very specific way. So all of these organizations are focused on equity. They're serving the distinct needs of their specific communities. And Rubicon, as the lead, is very focused on equity. They lead with an equity lens and they walk the talk. They hire and promote from the community with equity at the core of their decision making. So next slide. So another project that we're just getting started, and this is a direct result of the pandemic, we are standing up the Equitable Economic Recovery Task Force. We're only about 3 months into this, and we're kind of learning to build the plane as we go. It's a combination. It's comprised of businesses, public agencies, and community-based organizations throughout Contra Costa. We want to ensure that as we find our way back from this turmoil the pandemic has caused, that we don't go back to business as usual, that we recognize that this is an opportunity to address the systemic barriers to economic opportunity that this pandemic has only amplified, and that we develop resources and action steps that will help move us forward with intention on our journey in Contra Costa County. So another big piece of this is focusing on and elevating the voices of those most impacted. So in addition to the Recovery Task Force that meets once a month, we are conducting focus groups where we are inviting, again, leaning on our CBOs that are working with this population to engage those most impacted and having their voices heard and help us resolve and come up with the strategies as we move forward. Too often we move forward thinking we know what everybody wants, and we don't without listening to people's voices. So it's a big piece of this work is in joining the community, those most impacted, the micro businesses that are struggling to get some of these resources that just aren't tailored for them. So that's what I want to share this morning. And again, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to my colleagues for the great work that I'm hoping to steal and learn from.
Donna, thank you so much for sharing the journey that Contra Costa County is engaged in, and some powerful initiatives that are evolving over time. So I'm excited for you to participate in our panel dialogue. And so I want to introduce Bob Lanter, who's director for the California Workforce Board Association. And take it away, Bob. Bob, are you with us?
Unmute.
There you go, Bob.
Do it again.
Hang on, I got it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for unmuting me, and thanks so much for inviting me to be here with all of you today. And thank you, Dr. Johnson, for facilitating this panel. I want to also thank Workforce Community Solutions and the California Workforce Development Board for pulling this important series of conversations together and funding the Accelerator Grant. And I'm really honored to be on this panel and following for really great examples of our state's workforce development boards. As you can see, this work is being done across the state in these areas in particular. So I'm really honored to be with these workforce board directors. So for us here at the California Workforce Association, our story is a slightly different one. We're a statewide nonprofit. We represent not only the state's 45 workforce development boards, but we represent about 100 other community-based organizations, educational entities, labor organizations, business associations, etc. When the murder of George Floyd occurred, I remember it distinctly. It hit me very personally first, and kind of shook me as it shook all of us to the core as we watched the events unfold across the country and across our communities here locally. And for those of you who are on this call, many of you know me personally, we had personal conversations about this, and I believe our personal life and our professional lives become one. I've been doing workforce development in the Bay Area, in the East Bay. I'm a native of Pittsburgh, California, born and raised in East Contra Costa. Have worked with the Workforce Development Board there for a number of years. So I started thinking about workforce development and about the programs and systems that I have been a part of over the years, and have worked at various different levels, from local to state to national with the Department of Labor, and really feeling like, wow, we have missed a lot, right? We've missed a lot in this. And people were looking to us and continue looking at us, and rightly so, as workforce development, as the Workforce Association, to walk into this space where, frankly, in my opinion, at the state level, there's a void in leadership. And so we came up together with our board of directors on the statement, and I just took an excerpt from the statement, and I wanted to comment a little bit about it, because for us, this really is a beginning step. It really has to shift our thinking about these issues, and that's where the turn the volume up comes from. And there's a few things that turn the volume up means to CWA. And the first thing is, the workforce boards, the 45 of them in the state, they realize that they're only part of the workforce system. This workforce system and 400 years of systemic oppression isn't going to be fixed by tweaking programs in workforce boards, right? So they are part of the system. They do really need to work together and work with the greater workforce and education system on this. So that's the first thing. We need to partner. We need to be more inclusive in the work of our organization and the programs we run and the technical assistance we provide, and that means changes to our own organization. We need to recognize the voices of the people doing the work and the community-based organizations, many of you on the phone, and the people that you serve, and incorporate those voices. We need to be able to recognize CWA's platform that we have and the privilege that it allows us to be in terms of meetings, and work with our partners to strategize and leverage that platform. And lastly, and most importantly, we have to listen and understand. Thank you. Next slide. So to that end, CWA, next slide, please. We got together and we formed, back. Yep, the CWA Race and Equity Committee. And I'm really proud to say many of the directors who are on this phone are on the Race and Equity Committee, and Lysandra and Greg are my confidants and co-leaders of that committee, and they helped me pull together the agenda. We've come up with 16 organizations currently, and growing, have come up with the current things that you see on the screen that we're working on. And again, we're in the very beginning stages of this. The first step is the data, right? We've got to look at the data. Greg has said it, Josh has shown us, and Lysandra as well. We've got to look at data statewide. We've got to start with Title I. We've got to look at the industries where Black and brown people are underrepresented or are represented, and really partner with those. We need more resources for local workforce boards and workforce organizations so that they can replicate the great work that you heard about just a few minutes ago. We need to launch a training seminar series, and the workforce system has been screaming to us about starting with implicit bias, but the leaders on this on this panel have been shouting back at me saying, not just one training, it's a series. This is not a one and done thing. So we're working on developing that now. We're looking at the CWA structure. There's the bullet points there, really working with the professional. We did speak with Darlene Flynn, and we're really looking with the professional to come in and align our strategic goals for the association around race and equity. And then lastly, we're working with legislation and policy. You know, we're beginning at the highest level to work at the Workforce Innovations and Opportunities Act reauthorization. That act uses the word equity 0 times as it relates to inclusion and diversity. And we've got to do, it's 2,000 pages of non-equity, in my opinion. So we've got to do better than that. And the workforce boards, you know, the policy isn't just at the state level, it's at the national level. It's also at the state level and it's at the local level. So I'll just end with 2 other things. We're working really hard to make sure that the state is putting out policies that are as equitable as possible. And we haven't got in front of it. You know, we need all the help we can get. So we'll be looking to work with many of you on this. So when we're looking at things like the High Road Training Partnership, RFA, that just went out, we really need to work with the state to ensure that the voices of the communities that they are really trying to serve are indeed really being served by the dollars being invested, like the examples that we've seen in Oakland and San Francisco. The state can do the very same thing at the highest level. And we need to hold the state, the federal government, and you all need to hold your local county governments accountable for making sure investments are actually having the critical impact necessary. And I'll stop right there, Dr. Johnson, and we'll engage with questions, I'm sure.
Great, thank you so much. And I think one of the things that's profound about this panel is that each presentation supports the other, right? And I think it also reflects some essential core components of this work, right? And so the first question that I want to ask Director Lysandra is, and excuse me, because I've changed the questions a little bit in relationship to your presentation. So the model that you shared is chocked full of very specific details in crafting a really impactful program, right? So I'm curious, and I can imagine that many of us on this call are, which steps did you find that were the most difficult to implement, and which steps or stages were easier?
That's a great question. Am I off mute? That's the famous thing. You're on mute, you're off mute. You know, my challenge was the time frame in which I had to do this analysis, because, you know, as we were meeting in teams and deciding what each division would apply it towards, I knew would be ideal for our RP process. But I had a small window to do it. And you know, the folks from the Race and Equity can know I was very frustrated and that I felt like I didn't go in depth enough in each of these areas. Like I felt like we just touched the surface. The data was easy and that had already been pulled. So that was a plus because I was able to piggyback on a report that had already been produced. But really just like the stakeholder engagement and trying to time that with releasing the RFP in time. So there's areas that I felt like that didn't get the attention that I would like for it to get. But they kept reminding me it was better to have something, like this is something you've never done. And, you know, cliche or not, you know, the marathon, not a sprint cliche, that this is the long game. We're not going to undo systemic racism in one RFP cycle. And it's actually not enough. And I wanted to say this earlier, so I'm just going to sneak it in, that we can't program and service our way out of disparity, right? We could get more money, we could have more programs, and yet the conditions will be the same because the conditions have been the same. So really it's looking at how do we undo, how do we untangle, how do we redo how we do business? And so that's the thing I'm most happy about in being in the city and having the Department of Race and Equity as like a consultant to help me through this work. I'm new to this work. I'm not an expert. I'll share that. But I do have someone coming alongside me that is helping me guide this process.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And Josh, actually I want to also make an observation that each of the panelists, I think, really spoke to the fact that we are talking about unraveling systems and structures that for centuries, but in the workforce development world, decades and decades of a structure that's based on inequity, correct? And so I think it's incredibly important that we recognize that, and recognize that not everyone in this industry or in this field recognizes this, right? And so I have a question for you, Josh, is that, this brilliant, and I would say kind of, again, blinding flash of the obvious, right? Community voice and data, right? But can you speak to how you developed the relationships that allowed you to bring community voice to the table?
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. I mean, in many ways, I referenced it there as part of what I was sharing, but we're very fortunate to have the leadership of our mayor, who was a job developer in the earliest days of her career. She, Mayor London Breed, when I met her, I was a civil rights attorney, raising hell to try to get a local hiring law passed for our construction projects in the city and county. And she was running a nonprofit organization, and she was a commissioner at that time for the former redevelopment, trying to right past wrongs of what redevelopment bulldozers did to the neighborhood where she grew up in the Fillmore district. So it starts at the top, and we're very blessed to have a mayor who she literally asks for these reports. She wants to know where we're closing the gaps. Are we making progress, or are we not? So I think for internal government relationships, I mentioned we're kind of dealt the hand that we're dealt in San Francisco. It's a strong one. It's a really strong hand with the leadership that we have, in the form of Mayor Breed. Now then, our workforce board is a place where we bring together, of course, the business leaders, the labor unions, the community representatives, and other departments to forge those relationships. And again, I think the tone gets set from leadership, and then we can ratify through the board. But ultimately, if you don't have that hand, if you don't have a workforce board or a county board of supervisors or a mayor or someone who's saying, we want to go deep on racial equity, we want to go into those disparities in Pittsburgh, we want to go into those disparities in South LA, we want to go into and see what's happening in West Oakland, then that community voice is critical, and having that inside outside kind of strategy, because community knows what's going on. It all depends on, are we on the inside, the collective we, thus in these city positions, county positions, are we listening? Are we allowed to listen? And all of it kind of connects in I think, a unique set of relationships that, determine how fast, how much you must build, how incrementally, all those different components, like you've heard in the different stories that we've told, how you get there is just kind of determined by some of those relationship pieces, I feel like.
Dr. Johnson,
I was like, you go for it, because I can see you.
Yeah, can I ask, first of all, and you've heard what Josh is going through and what Lisandro is going through. And let me tell you my challenges, because I'm learning from them as well. I think they're well ahead of all of us. But the definition itself of equity, we're throwing equity around loosely. My staff member's actually on this session, and she's handling most of this for me. Her name is Victoria Mineta, and she just told me equity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. We keep throwing around equity. What I get from my department with its $100 million budget is, Greg, we're serving 16% of our customers are African American, and yet the population's only 6% of LA. Now, in the days of COVID, do you only do you only focus on prevention with an incurable disease serving a percentage of population, or do you serve the pathologies without the percentages? That's the danger. So my department's saying, but Greg, we're serving them. No, the pathologies exist in Latino communities and African American communities. It requires more investment. It doesn't require a percentage. That's the danger. And then when we talk about equity, that's what they're saying. That's equity. 16% African Americans, it's only 6% of the population. Inclusion is something different. It's actually putting the investments in that exceed percentages because there are pathologies that have to be tackled.
Greg, but I'm going to have to push back and challenge on that, because I don't think, and well, two things. I think that articulating our definition and what we mean is critical, right? But so therefore, I think it's essential, and I would like to hear Bob answer, respond to this, is that equity is not just about, oh, do you have the same, are you serving the same percentage of people that are in a particular community?
Right.
I think, so to me, that is just comparison of data points, 16%.
Right.
But so I think one of the, what this panel is speaking to is how do we use data in the appropriate manner? Because I think everyone on this call also knows that data can be used as a vehicle to serve our purpose about addressing inequity and systemic inequality, right? Or it can be used to say, oh, we're doing enough. So
Right.
Can you speak to that?
We agree. I agree with you on that. They're hitting me with percentages instead of results.
Yes.
They're saying we serve 16%. I want to know, what does service mean? How much money is going to training? What occupations they're placed in? Are you placing women in low-wage occupations? I agree. I'm saying there's, as a defense mechanism, they're giving me data as a solution, and it's not.
Yes, as
Right.
opposed to a methodology. Bob?
Right, and Dr. Yes, Dr. Johnson, and I would completely agree with you. And I think that, you said, 400 years of systemic racism. It's going to take us a lot of time to unravel these systems, but we're going to have to unravel the systems, because if you just look at Title I, which is only a very small piece of the workforce system. When I say systems, we got education systems and justice systems. So we're talking about the workforce system. The Title I piece, the data means nothing when you talk about the data that Greg was looking at, right? But when you start looking at the labor markets and you start thinking about the number of people, so let's just say a local workforce board has 85% placement, yeehaw. But you gotta start looking at who's getting placed and into what jobs and into what industries. So I just did some very quick Googling, right? And I do know there was earlier in the week, a report came out on the state of California's apprentices. There are about 98,000 apprentices in the state of California. Only 6.8 of them are women. That's only 6,500. And so that's a problem. So we have to start looking at the problem. Now, is apprenticeship bad? No. But if you talk to an apprenticeship advocate, which I am, you would say, oh, apprenticeship is the greatest thing in the world. But it doesn't mean apprenticeship is equitable or equal, right? And I think we do get tripped up, but we've got to look at the reality. The reality is we've got to unravel the systems. I've heard many workforce development professionals, Diane, Dr. Johnson, I'm sorry. I saw your name, Diane, I want to just call. I've heard many in the last 5 months that we've started working together say, our programs that we've been running for 30 and 40 years have done nothing but help poor people. That's true. That doesn't mean it's helped Black people or brown people or LGBTQ people or women.
Right.
So we've got to remember when we're talking about workforce boards, Josh said it right. Their hands, many of these on the panel, are very closely dealt with their elected official. Mm-hmm. And so These are system issues that we've got to tackle
Yeah.
with local elected officials and together. And so that's my take on it. We've really got to get under the hood. We've got to make sure we're looking at the real problems. And then we got to set some real goals. Like, because you get what you measure. So we've got to measure the right things.
Yeah.
And then if we don't hit those goals, we've got to hold people accountable.
Yes.
And so there's a long way from that, but we're working on it.
Mm-hmm. There's some great comments in the chat that I'm going to lift up. But before I do that, Donna, can you weigh in terms of when you think about the journey that Contra Costa is on? Can you speak to some of these issues about definition, about articulating metrics, et cetera, and some of the learnings that that your workforce board is engaged in?
Yes, thank you, Doctor. So I think some of this is very personal when I speak. I can't speak for everyone in my world or Contra Costa. So for me, it's almost paralyzing sometimes to look at the enormity of this work and then to question ourselves, myself, my area, in terms of what are we doing? What aren't we doing? So I find it very intimidating, but I want to say that should not stop us. It will not stop me. I am committed to looking at that and moving forward in whatever way that means. And it's acknowledging that I am taking baby steps, that we are taking baby steps, but we need to learn and move forward. So for me, the data has always been interesting. In my first introduction to WIOA and the metrics, and it's what you measure is what you do. And if you're not measuring it, you're not doing it. And we measure such a small piece. And it's always like, oh, we made our performance. But what is that telling us? And I mean, I honestly was a bit shocked when I first started into this world that, yes, we're helping. We're required to look at income and low income. But for a lot of the people we enroll people we know are going to do well to begin with. We're not really looking at those that really need the most help because we don't have the resources to really focus on those. So we look at what we can do to hit our measures and keep getting funded. But to me, that's a big problem because we're only working towards those performance measures that do not tell the story and do not help us move our work forward in the areas that we need to. So funding is a big issue when you relate it to those metrics, and that's all you're looking at.
Yeah.
So I just want to acknowledge our commitment to moving forward and learning more about what we can do in Contra Costa to further the work with intention. We need to do it with intention. If we don't and make it intentional, it'll get lost, it'll get forgotten. So we need to move forward with strategy and intention.
Great, thank you. Josh, you had a comment about, again, the continued work around equity and the I would say both leadership and accountability for workforce boards. Can you speak to that?
Yes, Doctor, and I think to the advocates that are on the session here, we know that advocates and community organizing is key to moving the systems, and we're on the inside to be moved. We can move as best we can, but that community voice and the national dialogue, Black Lives Matter, as a perfect example to move systems across this country. I just wanted to offer up where we've been able to kind of be on the inside, really benefit from that advocacy and attune our board and other leaders. I'm really blessed to have a colleague. I talked about her in the session, Director Cheryl Davis, who's the director of our Human Rights Commission. One of the first things that our mayor did was, this is something for the workforce board folks here and government folks here, is that one of the first things that our mayor did around workforce development was she took our Workforce Alignment Committee, which is a committee of all the different departments to spend workforce dollars, that's been historically chaired by the workforce director, the occupant of the position that she appointed me to. And she said, we're gonna have 2 chairs. And I always say I'm the second co-chair because Director Cheryl Davis, who she appointed co-chair of the Workforce Alignment Committee, she's the first co-chair and I'm the second co-chair because equity leads workforce development. So I think that's a pairing that you can look at as a way to really, it gives us a cover then to then present data like this because we have to. It's enshrined in practice and probably soon in ordinance. Director Davis and I together at our last board meeting last month said, here's a fact. This is undeniable data. This is estimated unemployment in our city by race and ethnicity. And you can still tell, I mean, the data don't lie. We're talking about it. We're making modest gains in bringing down unemployment citywide and across. These are the race ethnicity categories as the feds report out. We're seeing generally across the board decrease, but still continue to see Black unemployment citywide, nearly triple that of the average citywide. So these, having the ability to have this interplay where racial equity leadership is pushing the workforce system to put this data out there, it can be uncomfortable for employers. I spent time working in the labor movement, and sometimes this can be conversations that help us really forge strong community labor partnerships. But having the kind of cover, so to speak, to be able to have to show this data and then take the conversation where it goes, I think is a tool that we would offer up, is something that we've learned from that other areas could look at too.
Yeah, that's great. And Nathan Baptiste in the chat says, you know, when we're talking about the definition or the distinctions between diversity, equity, and inclusion, and he says diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being invited to dance, but
Right.
equity based on power and resource allocation means planning the party together.
Right. Right.
Right.
Great.
So,
Yep.
yeah, and I'm curious, and I'm just going to open it up, whoever, either Greg or Bob or Donna or Lysandra, this question, because I think one of the reasons that diversity, equity, inclusion is so challenging is that that different entities are at different stages and they have different assumptions about the work. Right. And so I'm just struck by the givens that I think that were in Lysandra's presentation about what's the baseline in terms of how we are approaching, and the fact that the workforce development, we are trying to respond to 400 years of differential in power, in resources, and access. Right. So what I'm curious about is how in the work that we're doing, do we address the competition for resources? Because now we're in COVID, right? So we see a lot of our resources being moved over to health, because it's like, well, if people aren't living, we won't have people to actually work with. So can any of you speak to the dynamic about competition for resources?
Yeah, I can speak directly to it. The city now, because of COVID, and so is the state, we're at 30% of revenue in terms of what we're realizing. So we've got all these edicts now because of what's going on in the street. We want equity plans from every department, et cetera. But we had to do layoff plans. And as you know, the last hired are going to be the first fired. The same thing with the state, and I know we have some state folks here. We've been told that maybe because prison to employment, they gave us all this money to engage in prison to employment activities over a year and a half now, that they may not continue that funding. How can we engage in dealing with prison reform if the commitment is only for a year and a half because things are tough with the budget? A budget is a moral document. If you're truly committed to it, you're gonna have to bite the bullet. And I want to mention the recent RFP was it's out there now, it's for an environmental workforce development program. The RFP didn't specifically, it says we welcome all these proposals. It didn't identify the communities. I want only proposals that serve this community. And we know communities of color have the highest incidence of lead in their homes, pollution, et cetera. Why didn't the RFP say, I only want proposals for these areas and I only want recruitment to take place in these areas? So we need it from the top. And of course, our boards need to reflect the community, and so does the state board. I'm sorry, Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, Bob.
I would just quickly echo Greg that, and this starts all the way in Washington, D.C. You know, Black and brown people, LGBTQ, people living in poverty, women. When employment was booming and the economy was great and the unemployment rate was low, those populations were still suffering. And now we have an economic disaster on our hands. And we've got to put pressure on the lawmakers and on the administration policy setters to ensure that their investments are going to serve the people who we all know will be the hardest hit and left behind in a recovery that's funded through our current systems and the way they've done for 40 years. And it's not going to be easy, Dr. Johnson, because there are really good, well-intentioned people in the state of California at the highest levels of our lawmakers. But there's a lack of real understanding on how to use an investment like Greg just mentioned in a way that really deals with the equity issue that we're talking about this morning.
Right.
And it's going to take a long time to educate, and it's going to be a political type of education. And it's really interesting because we are all on the same side of things, but at least in this case with the funding that Greg was mentioning, I'm not so sure about Washington, D.C. or any of that.
Sandra, I want to ask you Charles Turner's question, which is, we need the system needs to be undone, but who and how will new and more current needs both be, presented, I think, as in the last two examples, and how are we going to evaluate those? So if we know that we have to deconstruct a system that doesn't work, and then we know we have to replace the system, or even replace the orientation and the goals and objectives, but how do we get that new perspective to revise the system and the structures?
And I go back and offer the tool that we use in Oakland. I mean, that's how we've been able to really center the work. And I kind of wanted to piggyback on Bob and Greg. And while I totally agree that the RFP should address that, but locally, you can center race or neighborhoods. And so a case in point, there was a AB 1111, which was reducing, what was it? I forget the name of reducing disparities or
breaking barriers.
Breaking barriers to employment.
Right.
And in order for organizations across the state to apply for that, they had to partner with the Workforce Development Board. I had 19 organizations approach me. And so I included so I had to develop some criteria because we can't partner with 19 organizations. One of those was you will center race. You will report your data, and it will be outside of CalJobs. So it's like CalJobs is restrictive. It doesn't give us all the information that we need. So I said, you're going to be asked to report data in a way that you haven't reported it before. Are you willing to do that? Because we have to sign on to this work. And fortunately, I keep saying for Oakland is that we have that embedded in our systems to continuously challenge and look at and using the RBA. Really, like, is anyone better off in creating that? We were just touching the surface. I'm saying we're just a couple steps ahead of everyone. We're not far ahead. We have this department, we're engaging in the work. We're not there yet. We haven't realized it yet. But it's, and so even without additional resources, because that's always going to be our first thing, right? I've been in government 20 years, did nonprofit. It's always more resources. How do we, with the resources that we have, what can we do to advance racial equity and breaking these barriers and these systems down? What are those things that you can do right now? And I challenge folks to start where you are, just personally, where are you in the work? What things do you know and don't know? And do the work. Challenge yourself and look at what can you do? So that's my offer.
So I am in moderator purgatory because we have like just a couple of minutes left. So what I want to do is ask each panelist 30 seconds. What's the one thing that you want folks on this call to walk away with? Bob, you had your hand up first, so I'll let you go.
I was actually thinking about a different comment.
Okay.
I would just say this, that the one thing I want people to walk away with is what Lysandra just said, is that you can do something within your own sphere of influence. Director Greg Irish sent me a video from a UPS diversity and inclusion expert. And she said, the way to get things done is to move with your feet and quit talking about it and do it. So you all can do things within your own sphere of influence. And I plan to do the same. And I hope to work with all of you on doing that.
That's fabulous. Donna?
Yes, I'm going to agree with that. And like I said earlier, sometimes it's paralyzing to not know where to move and what to do, but to just move, to do something. And I also want to add on the money issue. Yes, we never have enough money to do our work. That's always an issue. But again, that can't stop us. And I'll go back to when we put that RFP out years ago, there wasn't enough money to support all those organizations that came together. They all put something on the table to do the work because they knew how important it was. So again, we all have to invest in this, commit to it, and do it with intention and not stop.
Yes, thank you. Josh?
You know, just speaking to community, because the fact is that we're in these positions in government for only a certain amount of time, and community outlasts politics. Community is eternal. And I think for us, the lesson of what I would like to share, because there is an internal lack of equity in this, the workforce board structure as authorized by the feds really discourages community participation for many reasons. Larry Robin, who's one of the gurus who has lots of thoughts on workforce, has pointed that out. That's something we'll have to change in the next administration around the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. But in the meantime, what we learned when Gwen Brown came and channeled her father and generations of activism from OMI Lakeview to call for that investment, much needed in that community, for us started a new segment of our workforce board meetings. Every quarter we start off with a new neighborhood spotlight and essentially just turn the floor over to the community to educate our entire workforce system around these values. And that's something that we've done now for 2 years straight.
Great, thank you so much. Greg?
Don't let, most boards are meeting during the day when working people are working. They're not meeting on weekends. Don't let these boards make decisions without community input. Most of us are making decisions where our providers are at these meetings, not the people who receive services. Get the word out that these boards have control of millions of dollars and demand that policies be made with your involvement at public hearings and on days when the public can participate. Demand the involvement of the communities instead of just like city councils and just like boards, we meet on Wednesdays during the day. People who are working and poor people can't have their input in those meetings.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Lysandra?
Thank you. I think the last word, what? Okay, so I double down on everything that everyone has said and challenge you, workforce board directors and workforce leaders and whatever title you may hold, to really examine your staff, your board. Is it reflective of a community that you serve? And if it isn't, why not? And then make the change and do what you need to do. Stand up, do the work. Our society depends on it. We cannot continue in the structures that brought us here. It must change.
Yes.
And we're the change.
Right. So I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to ask for I think there's a survey that link. Oh, actually, maybe I can put that. I don't know whether that there's a survey that we would like everyone to fill out. I'm not. Nope, that's a quote, but I'll put that in too. But if, yeah, great. There's a Survey Monkey. And I want to close with a quote by the environmentalist Paul Hawken, because I think it really speaks to the work that we're doing. He says, when asked if I am pessimistic or optimistic about the future, my answer is always the same. If you look at the science about what is happening on Earth, and I'm going to add, and look at what is happening, within the United States about inequity, and aren't pessimistic, you don't understand data. But if you meet the people who are working to restore this Earth, to restore our communities and the lives of the poor, and you aren't optimistic, then you haven't got a pulse. Mm. What I see everywhere in the world are ordinary people willing to confront despair, power, and incalculable odds in order to restore some semblance of grace and justice and beauty. to this world.
Beautiful.
Right. And so with that, I want to say it's been a delight to host and moderate this panel, an honor to listen and learn. And Donna, do we have anything else or do we just end?
I think that is it. I don't know if there was a survey someone was going to put in the chat, but I'm not seeing it. So maybe we'll, oh, there it is.
It
The
is.
survey is in the chat. Thank you.
So
Thank you, doctor. Thank you, doctor.
Thank you. Thank you
And
all
if
very
Yes.
much.
If people double click on the survey, you'll go directly to it.
Got it.
It's a.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you,
Thank you,
Donna.
Right. Take care.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Community
everyone.
Workforce Solutions.
Thanks, Community Workforce Solutions.
Thank you, everyone. This will be on the website.